When I wrote this talk, it was mostly with the most clickbaity title for a talk I've ever given, and it was really an opportunity to come up and talk about what I think is actually a real critical issue when you think about your omni-channel projects and the big projects. How many times does a project that has the best of plans, the best of intentions, end up on an executive's desk and die? And how many people have had that happen? It happens again and again, and I think there are a lot of reasons. Sometimes they're good reasons, but sometimes there's sort of the what's going on in the mind of that CMO or CRO or CIO, and why do these projects end up dying there? So what I wanted to do today is talk a little bit about the reality of what happens and why projects sometimes end up on the desk of a CMO and weird things happen. And what's a CMO thinking? What led them to ask the question they ask or make the decision that they sometimes make? And this is based on a lot of observations that I've made and just sort of going over my background. So I've had the good fortune of having worked on the brand side here at Acoustic, which I joined a couple of months ago. I previously worked for a company called Carbonite, which I ran marketing there for almost 4 years, helped convert that company from a B2C business to a B2B business, which is an interesting transition if you've ever had to do that while maintaining your B2C customers. I was also on the agency side for over 5 years before that. An agency called Wirestone doesn't exist anymore. It's part of Accenture Interactive, but actually worked on quite a number of omni-channel projects at that agency, leading clients through the process of how to figure out the very things we're talking about here, and then a lot of other roles, trying to always connect the what actually works with actually what gets done. And what I found over time was I became frustrated with why things didn't get done or why a stupid decision was made that I couldn't understand. So I started to sort of plumb the depths of what my peers and others were thinking, and I've collected anecdotes over time as a way to sort of be a handy, a little bit of a psychological insight into the types of things that executives may be thinking, and probably some of you have had to deal with this as well, and the types of ways that you can get past these hurdles so that when your project is well-intentioned and hopefully well-funded and hopefully you can show results, you're actually able to understand why it might hit a barrier and then how to get past that barrier. Because we all want to make sure our projects get done and we want them to be successful along the way. So I'm going to take you through a set of these secrets. We're going to hopefully have an opportunity, if not here, I'm here for the next couple of, through tomorrow to talk about this, and Acoustic will be meeting with several of you as well. Feel free to sort of dive into these and also share your own little secrets because I collect them. Over time, I have quite a little notebook full of things I've learned as to why people make the decisions they do inside a business and how that ultimately frustrates us or empowers us as people who are actually running projects and trying to build the business day to day. All right. So here are the secrets. Secret number one, and this one is one that probably we all deal with all the time. What the CMO has to report to the board decides lots and lots of decisions. How many people have dealt with a great project or a great idea, and then somebody goes to a board meeting and they come back from the board meeting and they say, yeah, that's not going to happen. Or there's a mad dash before a board meeting. I need you to find this information for me. Get it? And why? Well, what's actually going on there? Well, first of all, I love this quote from Kim Whittler. If you know Kim, she writes an article, she writes a column in Forbes. She was a former CMO. She now teaches, I believe, at Darden in the business school. Marketers don't end up on boards very often for lots of different reasons. I love this. They have little to contribute. That is the perception often of boards, particularly in America, where it's a very small fraction of corporate board members, particularly public companies, have professional marketers on them. So when the marketer or the marketing department ends up in front of the board, it's often from a position of weakness. It's often from a position of having to explain the very nature of what we do in marketing or commerce or what we are trying to accomplish and why it's critical to the business. It's also very closely related to why the CMO position is in so much danger, for lack of a better term, right now. I just read another article this morning about more and more companies eliminating the CMO position and turning it into a chief experience officer, chief revenue officer, chief customer officer. Right? Pick your favorite word to sort of swap in for the fact that marketing and the things that we do may not be fully understood and why it's important. So we confronted with this and confronted with the being in front of the board, the marketer has a few things to think about. First is boards tend to focus on risky, broken things. They don't like usually hearing good news, or they don't really pay much attention to good news. They tend to want to see where's the strategic risk. And so when a marketer comes in front of them and presents either good news or presents something that might be risky, they tend to run into some conflict in how they can explain it. So the marketer has to carefully craft the metrics that they bring in front of the board each quarter and make sure that they're showing the progress and that they're doing it the right numbers. When we were talking earlier, and Joe brought up the lifetime value and how you calculate that, right? Being able to show real numbers associated with the projects that you implement is critical to being able to help the board see how it connects to revenue. And that connection to revenue is often the big driver. But at the same time, many marketers are asked by the boards to simplify the data that they present. Rather than the data that we all consume all the time, that we get great Tableau reports and other places that we can really drive deep into the data, many boards ask that to be up-leveled and simplified. And that, in some sense, erases some of the importance and some of the detail of the picture that's important to explain why the things are happening the way that they're happening, why our omni-channel strategy, which is, in fact, not a simple thing, is or is not paying off when you have to up-level those metrics as well. So part of what is the struggle, if you will, for you and for your next level and your next level all the way up to the board is aligning the types of projects that you're doing and the types of output with ultimately how it's going to have to be presented in one form or another at the board level. And one of the tricks that I found I and a lot of my peers have developed over time is we make sure that when we begin a new project, we think about what ultimately we're going to have to explain to the board or to our CEO or others. And by working backwards from that ultimate board presentation, it gives us a sense of knowing that we can explain this in a way that snaps into what they're typically looking for on a regular basis. And so it really is amazing the amount of behavior that is driven by that quarterly getting up in front of that board and having to take them through what we did and what we're planning on doing. How many people have spent money on budget on MarTech? Right? I'm a MarTech vendor, trust me. I love when you spend money on MarTech. But it's a weird thing in that, again, this notion of I went over budget or I need more budget. Right? It's like, why doesn't it fit right in the, hey, here's how I planned for this project, and here's where I ended up with this project. And we read frequently about marketers now have the biggest IT budgets in an organization, spending more on more tools for more projects all over the place. And that's a great thing, except it's also a dangerous thing because you have to connect that spend back to the results that we talked about. And I like to recast marketing as less about I'm going to spend on MarTech, I'm going to spend on advertising, and I like to think about it as everything we do in marketing is a series of investments, bundled investments around specific outcomes that we're trying to drive for the business. Increase revenue, increase customer value, increase customer loyalty, decrease costs, whatever those things may be. And if you treat MarTech less as I just need to go buy a new system, and more as for these projects, I'm making these specific investments along the way, it makes it more digestible, ultimately, and easier to connect that spend with the yield that you hope to get along the way. It also allows you to move away from only thinking about a big CapEx, I need to make a huge investment, and more in, I'm going to make an investment and it's going to yield these results across this number of different projects as I go forward. And that helps justify the types of investments that often are necessary to get the solutions that you want when you're doing an omni-channel implementation, because it's very rare that you have all of the pieces in place. Now, the flip side is my rule of 80%. And I've worked with this rule. Many other folks that I've worked with over the years have done similar types of rules, which is don't buy a system for a small fractional increase in the value it's going to yield if you haven't looked at the technology that you have in place and see how far you can push it. And I would, every time a request came to me, it would say, implement, I want to buy this new thing. I'm like, okay, but I know this other solution that we have can do parts of that. Is that enough? And that notion of, is that enough, right? That applying that rule of 80% keeps you from making a lot of investments that may only yield fractional return and allows you to think about your budget to make the bigger investments that will yield the larger return. Because sometimes you have a problem you're trying to solve and you don't have a solution at all for it. And so how do you go about getting that solution versus when you want to make sure that you take the tools that you've previously invested in and continue to show the yield from them across projects over time. There is nothing more exciting, honestly, than something you bought 2 years ago and being able to go and tell the board, that thing that we spent money on 2 years ago, it's now delivering this new value today in a way we hadn't anticipated. That's a win. And that's a big win for you as a marketing team because it shows you can get value out of the projects over the long term. One of my former bosses regularly said this to me, dig deeper into the data. And I learned after a few months of working for that particular boss that what that meant was he did not like the answers I was showing him for the digging I'd already done. And so dig deep became this metaphor for, well, yeah, that's nice, but there must be, if you dig deeper, there must be really what I'm looking for in this data. And there's variance on this. But it's confronting the reality of when you have to take the project that you've worked on for months, quarters, years sometimes, and reduce it down to a small set of metrics that you then present. And if those don't land well, you get well, dig deeper. Give me a different way to show that. Present it differently. Show me more data. What does that mean? Well, I think it's important to understand the very first point here. And this article that I reference, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend. Don't let metrics undermine your business. Metrics are not strategy. And you should not confuse the two. And that article really highlights this. Right? And if you separate the people who are creating strategy from the people who are creating and reporting on metrics, you invariably have a gap. And it's a hard gap to explain. And when you think about it, that metrics are critical, but they're also something that is reporting on what has happened. They're not a plan for what should happen in the business. And I think that it's important that you take your metrics, we all have scorecards and reports that we put in place, and we try to connect the metrics to an action that we have taken or we will take in the future, versus here's what's happened. And right, take that, this is what we did, this is the project we implemented. Remember that project 2 quarters ago? Here's what we're yielding today based on that project. And remember that other thing I asked for that we want to do in the future? That's why I want this fancy omni-channel strategy that's going to extend to mobile. Well, here's how that metric's going to change, I hope, in the future. So metrics become more living and breathing entities rather than simply static reporting at the end of a quarter, here's what happened. And we can also use those metrics to dig deeper into, well, what does that mean for the customer itself? What is the customer experiencing? How are you looking at experience analytics and the types of frustrations that a customer may be having on your website, right? Having low conversion on your site, well, that's not necessarily a good thing, but is that also creating high frustration in customers? And what's the connection between the two? How are you fixing that one to address the other? So when you think about metrics as part of a strategy and that the two come together versus metrics as simply here's what happened, it becomes a more interactive model. And it also arms you and your boss's boss with a broader discussion to have for people who may not be as deeply steeped in marketing metrics, who may not understand all of the subtleties of click-through rates and attribution and fractional attribution and customer acquisition costs. Because oftentimes, I know I heard from a CFO regularly, it's like, okay, we need your customer acquisition cost to be X. Awesome. And then, after I got to X, he said, well, that's awesome, but you're not getting there fast enough. Like, oh, so you need my customer acquisition cost to be X in 12 to 24 months. Okay, now we start to get deeper and deeper into the reality of that's a strategy that's manifesting itself versus the metrics themselves. And I think that helps build projects in the context of the larger type of value we want to return to a business. No specific investment should ever be made if we're not going to see value returned back to the business in some form over time. There's so many secrets. I love the fact that this one happens all the time. You can substitute your favorite metric in for conversion rates. Right? Things are up, things are down. I'm not quite sure how to make it happen again. and it's sort of funny in that we all confronted with sometimes we just don't know. Sometimes we do, but sometimes we have to dig really deep. And there's nothing worse, absolutely nothing worse than being in front of an audience, board, peers, and explaining this is what's happened and not being able to go into, and this is why it's happening based on these things that we know. And I think that it has partly to do with the types of metrics that we tend to report. We tend to report things that are easy to grasp, but not necessarily easy to explain or not necessarily deeply connected to the way that the business operates. And again, I reference if any of you are familiar with the Serious Decisions metric spectrum. If you're not, I can give you a reference for it and explain it. But the top box talks about this notion of activity and output metrics and impact metrics. And actually starting to think about activity, the things we do, output, the things that happen because of the things we do, and then impact, the actual impact on the business, right? So, activity is, we got a bunch of likes on something, or we got a bunch of retweets, or we got a bunch of clicks. Output is, and then we got a bunch of leads or a bunch of inquiries. And then impact is, and then we created pipeline dollars. 3 distinct things that have different meaning for the business. Many marketers tend to focus a lot, unfortunately, on only activity and output versus the impact metrics. And they don't connect all of them. So finding ways to connect these metrics and report on them across the board is exceptionally helpful for getting past that I don't know why it happened. you can trace back. These activities created this output, created this business impact along the way. And there's also this other notion of the limitless growth curve. And I've had to deal with this in front of boards myself. When you see curves that go up to the right, there's this assumption that is sometimes made that that can continue on forever, up and to the right, into infinity. And it can't. There are just limits on it, right? No matter what your business, whether you're B2C, B2B, you're direct to consumer, you go through other channels, there are in fact limits to how that good curve can keep on growing. Do you know those limits? Do you know how you're going to measure those limits? Do you know how to temper expectations around those limits? For example, just knowing your audience size or your potential total addressable market or total audience that you can go after helps you understand where those limits get reached. And if you can, when you have a, hey, great day, right? We have a curve that goes up and to the right. Draw the line that says, we think this might be the limit. And we think that we can't just spend and hope that it's going to go up. It might actually curve down. And we demonstrated this at my previous company where we learned the curves, right? And so we could keep spending on search and other digital until the curve started to go down. And being able to explain that sometimes that curve is going to go down is an important component of being able to put the whole picture together, right? The best of omni-channel projects you're going to implement is not going to create a curve that goes up forever. It's going to give you the appropriate level of incremental growth, the appropriate level of incremental revenue, greater customer happiness, experience, but it's not an infinite well of happiness. And that helps you set expectations so that when the curve goes down, I've already started to set those expectations. And I talked last point here about AI tools. And AI is sometimes an overhyped term. We overhype it at Acoustic. I take full credit for the fact that we do that as well. But AI can be helpful for taking things where machine learning and automated insights can give you better activities so that you can make things more repeatable again and again and again. And you can deliver better conversion rates or other pieces at a faster pace sometimes if it can capture and understand what are some of the underlying behaviors that a machine learning tool or an AI tool can see faster and quicker than a person or an analyst can typically see. So you can spend more of your brain power on the things that really are complex and deep and how you're going to improve the business based on them. And each of these pieces, as we go through these sort of why projects end up dying somewhere along the way, it's because you get this constant sort of tug of war between reporting on results and showing the investment and trying to build the life cycle of a project that's going to yield something super powerful for the business over time. All right, this one gets me in trouble when I talk with peers about it all the time, but I honestly believe that this is true. The modern CMO and the modern marketer is not necessarily 100% the modern technologist. Technology is complex. We probably in this room all have a deeper understanding of technology than another comparable room that might be focused on a different element of marketing or e-com or demand creation. But CMOs are forced into discussions endlessly around technology. Whether they like it or not, to be a CMO today is you have to be prepared to have discussions around technology. And some folks understand it, some folks don't, but where do you all play in that? And that to me is that the smart CMO, even the ones that do understand technology, they find the person who really understands technology and can help them shape strategy around it, whether that be a head of marketing ops or a peer in the IT organization, whatever that may be. And the question I ask you to ask yourselves is, are you that person? Are you the person that can help your boss understand the deeper sort of implications around technology? Are you the person that can help them see the value, not simply of your coming to the table with, I want to launch this particular omni-channel initiative, but let me explain why we're going to make these type of investments in this type of technology over the next 4 quarters and how it impacts the business so that you, CMO or CEO or wherever you may report into, are better equipped for the next level of discussion. And it takes away that fear sometimes that the senior executive may not fully understand what you're actually doing. Because projects that are big and complex easily start to get less and less clear as it moves up the organizational ranks. And you should be the one who can help your boss and your boss's boss explain that. But at the same time, remember that technology is not the goal. The business is the goal. Right? The growth in those KPIs that drive the business is the goal. And making sure you can bring that back to the table, it's less about yes, we want to do this project, but here's how it's going to improve our business so that the CMO or other equivalent roles can help carry that torch of what they're doing to grow the business overall. And finally, this notion of accountability for results is more important than understanding of the methods. Yeah, right? Sometimes you're the person who's accountable, and you may not understand every single thing that got to the thing you're actually accountable for. You should try to, but you should also have folks on your team who can help get into the depths of that. So each of these pieces helps you as you're thinking about the projects you're implementing and the technology that you're buying and the metrics that you're building up and the way in which you're sort of conceptualizing a project as not simply I'm going to implement omnichannel for my business, but I'm going to transform my business from the top down, and I'm going to achieve these type of impact metrics, and I'm going to empower my boss and my boss's boss and the team to go in front of the board each quarter and deliver a message that is clear and that they can defend, and that helps drive the business forward. All right, final secret of the CMO is, yes, once a quarter we still get asked to make it pretty. I still get asked regularly to make it pretty. I love that I get asked to make it pretty, so there, I've now made it pretty for you, as we do, and just sort of ending on the note of talking briefly about Acoustic, because why am I spending so much time thinking about this? Because we sell a marketing cloud. We have a set of products that address these very issues of how do you build the right tools, campaign, content, analytics, pricing and promotion as well, that deliver on this value. So I think about this because as a tools vendor, I don't want you to buy my solution if you're not really going to understand how to get the greatest value out of it and how your boss can present that, hey, here's how we got the greatest value out of it. Working backwards from that board presentation to, oh, okay, I'm going to have to present this at the end of the quarter. How am I going to get there? That's helpful in thinking about how we move this forward. So with that, I will say thank you. We're available for questions. I love to talk about this, and if you have more dirty little secrets that you want to share, or not even necessarily dirty, but it helps me sort of build my sort of knowledge base of why executives make the decisions they do and how you can build better projects as a result.
Thank you.